G'day groovers, rockers, and in between. This is Vinyl Vibes. I'm your host, Jack Hodgins. Today we are talking with founding member of The Seekers, Keith Potger. The Seekers were formed in 1962 with Keith Potger on lead guitar, Athol Guy on double bass, Bruce Woodley on rhythm guitar, and the iconic Judith Durham on lead vocals. By 1964, the group would be Australia's most internationally successful music group. Keith can be heard on all the Seekers hits such as I'll Never Find Another You, The Carnival Is Over, and Georgy Girl. Keith has joined me via Zoom to discuss his time with the group and his more recent solo work. G'day Keith, and welcome to Vinyl Vibes.
Hello Jack, thank you very much indeed.
Let's start at the beginning. You were born in 1941 in Colombo, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Can you take me through, do you have any musical memories from that early stage in your life?
No, I don't. I learned some songs from my dad. He was quite a good singer, and he played the banjo ukulele, and that was my introduction to music. But I suppose going back to my primary school days, I suppose we had singing. But there's a particular form of music in Sri Lanka called bailas, and they're very, very simple ditties that, a couple of lines, and so I probably learned a few of those, but I don't really remember that too much because I was only 6 or 5 or 6 or 7 when we left Ceylon to come to Australia.
Do you remember much about that travelling to Australia and getting to Australia?
Yes, I do. I remember a fair bit about it. We were on a ship. It was called the Strathaired, and we had the crossing the line ceremony as we went across the equator. And I had to sing a little song, and I was awarded a little bottle of barley sugar. So that was my prize because I came first in that prize. Yeah, that was the start of my penury. I've been broke ever since.
Yeah, and look, you mentioned earlier that in Sri Lanka you didn't really get into music too much then, but when you got to Australia you did. So what kind of got you into music? What was the pinpoint that you can recall that you kind of said, I like this?
Well, it was because my dad got a guitar through a correspondence course, and it had a little. It was a funny little guitar. I think it was made of balsa wood or something, and it was really quite quaint. Didn't sound all that flash, as I recall, but he got a bit disenchanted with it and decided that he'd leave it in a cupboard. I suppose 11 years of age, I suppose, at that stage. And I fished it out of the cupboard and put a new set of strings on it, and then I started looking at the chord book that had come with the guitar from this correspondence course, and they're all country songs like, I got spurs that jingle, jangle, jingle, and jambalaya on the crawfish pie, all that sort of stuff. And so that was my introduction to music. But even then, it really didn't occupy a big space in my life.
Yeah, well, when did it start to become a big part of your life? Because, did rock and roll have something to do with that? You were about 14 when that kind of 14, 15 when that kind of kicked off. Did rock and roll kind of have a big play in that?
Yeah, that's right. There was quite a turning point because I was at high school, Melbourne High School, when I was in fifth form, which was year 11. That was in 1957. I formed a trio with 2 of my buddies, Bob Camfield and Bob Turnbull, and we had a school, a contest that was arranged to raise money for charity, and one of the forms had decided to put on this the singing. A contest. It wasn't just singing; people could do poetry or anything, and we entered and we won. So that was a turning point because that meant that I had to bring my guitar activities into the group because neither of the other 2 boys played an instrument. So I was the sole accompanist. It stood us in good stead because we were booked to do some gigs, clubs, and things like that around Melbourne.
And that was the Trinamics, right?
The Trinamics, yes, the Trinamics. And the next year, we a friend of ours asked to join the group, and we came up with in a blinding flash of inspiration, we came up with the name the Trinamics Plus One. So.
What kind of songs were you playing in the Trinamics then? Rock and roll. I think also a bit of doo-wop I've heard. What was the kind of songs that come to mind?
Yeah, well, the songs that we sang in our contest were Ramona and Down by the Riverside. And Down by the Riverside, they were hardly rock and roll. And in fact, Ramona was a song that I grew up with in my parents' repertoire. Coincidentally, a few years later, it became a huge hit for The Bachelors. And I think we were ahead of our time, as far as I can tell. but we weren't really a rock and roll group. Playing an acoustic guitar and three harmony voices just wasn't really rock and roll.
By the late 50s, you're leading the Trinamics and Athol Guy is leading the Ramblers, and somehow that kind of comes together to form the
Yep.
Escorts. Yeah, so how did that kind of come to be?
Well, the Escorts, both groups disbanded. The Trinamics Plus One disbanded, and Athol's group disbanded. And Athol, I'd known of Athol, even though he was a year ahead of me at Melbourne High School. And Bruce Woodley, whom we'll mention later, was a year behind me. But we didn't really have any substantial contact, or certainly no musical contact, while we were all at school together. And I guess that 1 year separation really means a lot in the school hierarchy. But how it came about was that I was working at a record shop in Melbourne called Thomas's Records. So I had a fair amount of contact with musical people because of that. And I got in touch with Athol and said, look, why don't we form a new group? And Bob Turnbull from the Trinamics, he joined us. And we found this wonderful singer, Ken Ray. We just put an ad in the paper, and he answered it, the dear boy, and fantastic voice. And that was at the time of the doo-wop groups. So we were emulating, if you like, groups like the Diamonds and the Four Lads. I don't know, all of them, the Four Preps. Everything seemed to start with the four in those days.
So you're in the Escorts. I mean, when did you start to get? When did you start working at the ABC? When did that kind of start?
Well, the Escorts were very lucky because we managed to get a couple of TV series, the main one being the Lorraine Desmond show on the ABC. And because we were a harmony group, Athol had left the group by that time. He had a bronchial issue and he had to leave the group. So just the three of us, Bob Turnbull, Ken Ray and I, went up to Sydney and became fully professional and fully starved, and we then managed to secure these series on with Lorraine Desmond, and they were two of the most wonderful times of our life. Really, I think we all agree on that. And then the group was not really doing all that well, so I already had built up some contacts in the ABC because of the work we were doing for the TV shows, and the opportunity came up in Melbourne. We were in Sydney, and the opportunity came up in Melbourne to apply for a job called the trainee in radio production. So I applied for that job and I got it. And that meant moving back down to Melbourne, which I did. And so I started live producing radio shows. And so I wasn't really a trainee. They chucked me in at the deep end. And so I started producing radio shows and working with big bands and soloists. And it was just a fantastic time.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a fantastic time. And I mean, when did the Escorts become known as the Seekers? Like, what point did that kind of take place?
It was when we moved back to Melbourne. When I say we, Ken Ray and I moved back to Melbourne, and Bob Turnbull stayed in Sydney because he was a television cameraman and director by that time. And so Ken and I went back and we joined up with Athol, who had then got over his bronchial problems. And by that time, Athol had joined an advertising agency, and Bruce Woodley happened to be working at the advertising agency. And Bruce had just started playing the guitar, and Athol had started playing the bongos. And before I returned to Melbourne, they had been singing at various people's parties and things like that, and it was really casual and obviously a lot of fun, and probably they were only doing it to try and get chicks anyway. So when Ken and I got back to Melbourne, we joined up with Athol and Bruce. So that was the start of the Seekers, was a four-male group. Ken Ray was the fourth member. We were starting to get a nice little reputation for ourselves as the Seekers, but as four men. Ken then met this lady and decided to get married, and so he decided that he thought it best if he left the group because he didn't want to mix singing with being in the group, and he left the group. And then we went looking for a replacement, and Ken had this fantastic high voice. You can still hear his voice on on one of the YouTube clips, actually, from the Bert Newton show of 1959. Brilliant voice. Anyway, he instead of replacing him with a bloke, we thought, well, why don't we find a girl? And Judith Durham at that stage, she was known as Judy Durham in those days. She was making a bit of a name for herself in Melbourne, singing trad jazz. And so we approached her. Well, in fact, the way it worked out was because Athol Guy had moved to another advertising agency by then, because we all had day jobs, you see. Athol Guy had moved to another advertising agency, the J. Walter Thompson, and Judith applied for a secretarial job at J. Walter Thompson. Lo and behold, there she is, working in the same zone as Athol Guy. So Athol said, "Look, we're singing at the Treble Clef on tonight, Monday night. Why don't you come along and sit in with us and see whether you like the sound?" So she did, and that was the first time we sang with Judith. Bruce and I had not met. Bruce, in fact, picked her up from her home and brought her to the Treble Clef. I hadn't met her until she arrived at the coffee lounge. So we all sat down and started singing. It was just like that. That was the start. It was really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I mean, like hearing Judah for the first time, like what was that experience like for you? Like what were you what was going through your mind hearing her voice?
Oh well, I was gobsmacked by the whole situation. Because we're a pretty loud bunch of blokes, and then suddenly to find this girl who's not a wimpy singer by any means, and to hear her, sort of hitting note for note with us and being able, and there were no microphones in the coffee lounge, of course. We were completely acoustic, and there she was, and she brought some songs to us, and we half knew them, and she half knew some of the songs that we were doing. So we kind of made it up as we went along at that stage, and that was the start of the group.
Yeah, and of course you built the audience up in Melbourne, and you eventually got to sign to W&G Records. And I mean, how did you come to get signed to W&G Records? What was like that journey from like that kind of first gig with Judith to like getting signed to the record company?
Well, this is where the ABC comes into it, because I was still working at the ABC at that stage, and I had a very good friend, the recording engineer at the ABC, Cameron Smith, and there was a Sunday or a couple of Sundays that were available when there was no one in the ABC studios. So we kind of snuck in, and Cameron came in and set up the mics, and we recorded some tracks. We'd already done that when Ken was in the group, actually. So we had some tracks with Ken singing lead. But then when Judith joined us, we replicated that and went into the studio and recorded some more tracks with Judith. And then we had something to present to people. Judith, in the meantime, had drawn the attention of Ron Tudor, who was the A&R man at W&G Records at that time. And so he wanted her to present some material as well. So, and I knew Ron Tudor because of my work at Thomas's Records. The whole thing came together in a kind of pincer action where I was able to get the recordings done, and we presented them to Ron Tudor. And then instead of just signing Judith on her own, he signed the whole group. And so that was how that happened in 1963.
Yeah, and do you remember much about recording that first album, introducing the Seekers, like in the studio? Like, do you have any memories?
Yeah, the W&G Studios was the first time that we'd been in that circumstance of a full-scale recording studio, working with Russell Thompson, the engineer, who's a wonderful man. And we was pretty much given our own time. They didn't... we weren't sort of limited to 3-hour sessions and things like that. So we were able to put down songs that were popular with the coffee lounge audience that we'd built up. Well, it was the days of mono recording. So if you wanted to do anything more than a few tracks, you'd have to so-called bounce from play one machine back onto another machine while you were singing the new bits or playing the solos and things like that. But that gave us a really good grounding in being able to work with that technology at that time. So if we kept our wits about us, and we made the best we could. We also did some backing vocals for some artists. There was a South Australian country singer, Johnny Mack, who we're still in touch with. And we did quite a few backing tracks for him for his album, and Frankie Davidson and Adrian Usher, a few people like that. So we were kind of a go-to backing vocalist group as well.
Listening to Introducing the Seekers, we've got songs like When the Stars Begin to Fall, This Train, very kind of folk-orientated songs. And we kind of spoke a bit about how you kind of came from a rock and roll kind of doo-wop kind of background. How did the Seekers get that? What kind of made you all go in that kind of folk kind of sound? How did that kind of come to be?
Well, there were groups around like the Kingston Trio, and this was probably slightly before Peter, Paul, and Mary. But Kingston Trio, and there was a folk thing happening, and it was probably led by Pete Seeger, who was the main driving force in the Weavers. And the Weavers were one of our favourite groups, and we loved their harmonies. And coincidentally, that was a group of one female and three males, and they had a very strong female lead. I guess they were our role models, and the folk repertoire was fairly easy to pick up. It was a bit, I mean, in some instances, rock and roll is fairly easy to pick up if it's only three chords, that sort of thing. But folk songs were had a sort of joyousness about them, and they had an ability to include the audience, which was another thing. So from our coffee lounge days, we always realised that if you sang songs that the audience could join in with, that was a real bonus.
On your first album, introducing the Seekers, I've also kind of heard that the album cover, you weren't on it because of your job at the ABC, and I'm just thinking like that must have not felt very good for you, given how it's your first album and you can't be on the front of it. Like, how was that for you?
That's right. It was a silly mistake, actually. I could have done that. I was being far too conservative about not going down that path of having another, or owning up to having another job, because as it turned out, we were on the brink of giving up our day jobs anyway. So I could have, with some sort of dignity, left the ABC. But the person who's on the cover in place of me is Ken Ray, who was the original Seeker. So there we are. There was some what should I say, karma in the fact that Ken was on the cover.
When did you end up like leaving your day job? Like, what was the point where you kind of said, right, we're getting enough gigs, we're earning enough income here, like we can quit the day jobs and do music full time?
That came about because the Sitmar shipping line gave us the opportunity to sing on their ships. We did several cruises for them around the South Pacific Islands, around Fiji, Tonga, places like that, and they liked what we did, and they offered us the chance to sing on one of their ships going to England. And the idea was that we would jump off in Southampton, stay there for 10 weeks while the ship came back to Australia, and back to Southampton, pick us up after 10 weeks. And then they also offered us more cruises for that year. I'm talking about 1964 now. So pretty much the whole of 1964 was going to be cruising and singing on the ships. And that was why we decided to give up our day jobs. And we thought, well, let's take it sort of sounded a bit like a gap year to us. And we all decided to chuck in the jobs and go sailing.
Before you kind of went sailing, and I think March 1964, I've read, like, I was looking through the discography of the Seekers, and you've got two albums in 1964, the Seekers and Hide and Seekers, and I was just wondering, like, did you guys record those in Australia, or or were they like in England? Like, because I was just thinking, like, those are like, to get two albums out before you kind of leave in March 64. I was thinking that if you recorded those albums in Australia, it would have been a bit of a rush to get them out, kind of thing.
That's right. No, they were recorded in England, and that was another way that doors have opened up for the group in the most incredible way. Is because we had an Australian friend of ours, John Nankervis, was living in London at that time, and he was working for the World Record Club. Introduced the group to the directors of the World Record Club. They liked what we did. They'd heard the W&G album, and they wanted to do one album that was recorded in one day. Actually, the whole album was recorded in one day at Olympic Studios with a wonderful engineer, Keith Grant. And they liked that so much, they decided to record another one, and they gave us 2 days to record that one. And that included string orchestra, led by the wonderful Bobby Richards. And he became our go-to arranger for all our work from then on. But they were recorded in, I think it was probably, we arrived in May of 1964, and they were recorded, I think, in July. It wasn't long after we arrived, anyway. So we had to get into gear pretty smartly. That was what we did. So those two albums were recorded for the World Record Club.
And I was just thinking too, like, on that, when you were on, I think, because it was a 5-month stay on the ship the first time. It was originally going to be 10 months, five months each way. Like, I was just thinking, like, when you guys were playing, like, the onboard entertainment, like, were you making sure you guys were playing different songs here and there, or like, were you playing the same set, or like, yeah, how did you go about that?
Well, the Sitmar people, right at the last minute, they sprang on us the requirement that we also not only play folk songs during the afternoon, but we also had to play dance music at night. So we had to rush out and get instruments. So I bought an electric guitar, Athol bought an electric bass. Bruce was on drums, and Judith was a very handy keyboard player anyway. So got an electric piano, and we formed a little rock and roll quartet. So that at that time we were actually playing rock and roll, and I was doing solo like the Ventures, Walk Don't Run, and those sorts of songs. And the Beatles were around at that time, so we did a few of their songs and we cobbled together this rock and roll set. But we didn't have to do that every night. So I suppose over the 5 weeks that we were on the ship, we would have had a repertoire that we mined and mixed and matched as best we could, so that people wouldn't get bored. But somehow I think we managed to pull that one off, actually, by playing all these rock and roll things in the evening and doing our folky stuff during the day.
Did you enjoy living on the ship? Like, were the living conditions all right, or yeah?
Oh yeah, it was a ball because we weren't treated like crew. The humble crew, they were down in the bowels of the ship,
Oh, okay.
and we were treated like passengers. So we actually had proper cabins, and that made the journey vastly better. And of course, it was a fun time, and we all have friends from that ship time that we're still in touch with now. So there's some of our friends we made during those voyages.
Yeah, and of course, when you got to the UK, you're expecting to go back on the ship, for another 5 months back to Australia. But of course, that didn't end up happening, and I mean, that's really where the Seekers' career really took off. I mean, can you take me through that? I mean, I think you're on TV playing to 10 million, like an audience of 10 million people, 2 days afterwards or something like that. It wasn't very long afterwards. Yeah.
That's right. Well, we had sent to an organisation, a booking organisation in London, our album, and also a kinescope of a TV show that we did with Graham Kennedy. So just a film, in other words. And we sent that out before we left Australia. And by the time we arrived in England in the third week of May, the booking agency had already acted on the material that we sent them, and they realized that we had something. So they'd booked us this gig on the Cliff Mitchellmore show, and it literally was, as you say, a couple of days, or in fact a day after we arrived, and our instruments were not cleared by quarantine, so we had to rent other instruments. And we were miming in those days. Everyone mimed in those days. So it made it a bit more straightforward for us to just play rented instruments to do this TV appearance. And that was it, 10 million people. And I often say that in those days, Australia's population wasn't much more than 10 million.
And of course, you soon meet Tom Springfield as well. I mean, how did that kind of come to be? Because I think you were playing with Dusty Springfield on one of her shows. And yeah, take me through that. How did that kind of come to be?
So there are a couple of reasons for getting together with Tom Springfield. One was that he has a magnificent 12-string guitar, and I thought, wow, I'll try and get in touch with him and see whether I can buy his 12-string guitar, because he wasn't performing anymore. And then, as luck would have it, the booking agency got us a gig in Blackpool. Dusty Springfield was the headliner. So I contacted her and spoke with her, and she then became a very good friend of the group, as it turns out. But she then promised to ask Tom about his guitar as a side issue, as a separate issue. Our agent was Eddie Jarrett, and then he became our full-time manager. He was looking for material for the group, and he realized that since the Springfields had broken up, that Tom Springfield was not doing much. So he got in touch with Tom. As another side issue, Tom had already sold the 12-string guitar, so I was out of luck there. But I was still keen to get 12-string guitar. Eddie got in touch with Tom and said, do you have any material? Here's the group. He played them. He played in the WG record and the World Record Club albums. And Tom fell in love with the group, and he had this melody he didn't have any lyrics for, and he finished the lyric, and that became "I'll Never Find Another You." So that was in something like October of 1964. So we went in the studio and recorded it. By that time, I'd acquired another a 12-string guitar. So that was how that whole thing with the riff and everything like that, and the sound of the group kind of morphed into more than the classical sort of guitar backing that we had. But Judith, of course, was featured very strongly, and we did our best to keep up with her, and and it was wonderful. That was the result.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a 3-hour session. We had to record the main song and the B-side in one session, and Judith was living with her sister at that time in London, in West London. And she slept in, and we were all at the studio, whatever time it was. Let's say it was 10 o'clock in the morning, something like that. We were sort of wondering, what? It's 9:30 now. We're supposed to be warming up for the session, and so I had to ring a taxi, and Judith was really upset because she didn't want us to spend money on the taxis. Oh no, I'll catch a train. She said, no, bugger that. You'll get a taxi. And so she arrived, and by that time, that gave us a chance to put down the backing track and that sort of stuff before she arrived. But anyway, once she arrived, but the other side of that coin is, of course, that we had learnt the song and practiced it outside the studio. So it wasn't as though we were learning it while we're in the studio. We already knew the song, we knew the harmonies, I knew the guitar parts, and so it just was a matter of putting it down on tape. And we worked with a wonderful engineer, Norman Smith, who had also worked with the Beatles, and so we're in great hands right from the start.
Yeah, and of course you mentioned the 12-string guitar, and of course that song opens up with a riff from a 12-string guitar, and I'm thinking, like, what inspired you to do a 12-string guitar instead of a 6-string guitar? What is it about the sound that kind of resonates with you so much?
Well, I guess it was, I started getting interested in the 12-string because of my love of what Pete Seeger was doing. As I mentioned earlier on, he was such an influence on me, not only for the guitar but also the banjo. And so I really felt that had an unusual sound, and it somehow it just seemed to gel with what the group was trying to do at that stage, with Athol playing bass and Bruce playing 6-string guitar. He had no desire whatsoever to play anything but 6-string guitar and banjo. So we're able to create this kind of sonic palette, if you like, because of the variety of the instruments. And it just fitted in really well. And Judith was magnificent on the tambourine.
Do you remember do you remember when it first went to number one, like where you were when you kind of were told your group has gone to number one?
Yeah, I can remember it really well. We were all at the Savoy Hotel in London for a function. The charts came out. I think it was on a Tuesday or something like that, whatever it was. And suddenly there we were. We got the phone call that it had reached number one. It took a while because we had to get into the top 30 because the BBC didn't have on Top of the Pops, didn't have any songs that were not in the top 30. So to get into the top 30 meant that we had to be heard. That was where the pirate radio ships came into the picture, because they actually liked it, and so they were playing it. And gradually, because of their activity, people became aware of the song, and we had already done a little bit of television as well by that time. So people put two and two together and realised that was the song and this was the group that was singing it. And it started to sell in sufficient numbers to get into the top 30. And then after it got there, that was over the period of Christmas, and it was number one in the middle of February.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I was looking at the list of singles that the Seekers did, and you had another hit, of course, A World of Our Own. But before that, I'm not sure on the months that it came out, but before that you had a song, What Have They Done to the Rain? And that I think that was 74 in Australia, didn't hit quite as well. I mean, when that kind of happens, when you're in a group and you've got, this massive song, and then you kind of have one that doesn't do as well. I mean, were you guys worried about that at all? Like at the time, of course, it obviously turned out you would have more hits, but yeah, how did that feel at the time?
Well, Tom Springfield, bless his heart, he wrote World of Our Own just shortly after writing I'll Never Find Another You. So from the point of view of our English releases, we followed I'll Never Find Another You pretty much immediately with World of Our Own, and in hindsight, probably a little bit too quickly, because we could have waited a little bit longer for World of Our Own to be released. But nevertheless, that's history. Water That Under the Rain was one of the songs we recorded for the World Record Club. So if that was released pretty much without our knowledge, actually, and so it was not really something that we were fully aware of or we fully supported. Because of that, we were kind of taken by surprise about that. Whereas World of Our Own was the official follow-up to I'll Never Find Another You. And then at the end of that year, in 1965, Tom again came up with the goods, and we had The Carnival Is Over as our third single in that year.
You mentioned Tom a few times, like, as he was in the production-wise of things. I mean, what was he like as a producer? Like, how did he work with you guys? Like, because I mean, he also produced A World of Our Own. I think he might have produced the Carnival Is Over too. What was he like on the production side of things?
Oh, he was very gentle. And I think he knew, let's put it this way, he knew what he wanted, but he also left the group a lot of leeway for us to present ourselves as we thought his song should be presented. For instance, the whole arrangement of World of Our Own was, he just gave us the song. I arranged the harmonies, we did the 12 string and this and that. And the same with Carnival Is Over. It was more of an orchestral backing for that song, which it obviously deserved. He kind of just presided in a very professional way. He knew what he wanted. Again, he was working with top engineers as well. And we were still in that era where it was pretty much mono recording, or we might have progressed onto 2-track recording or something like that. So it was pretty primitive. And to have what he wanted in his head while we were going through that process of recording from one machine onto the next and adding harmonies or adding the tambourine or adding this or that, and then to come out with that final result is it takes a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge.
In 1965, you were voted Best New Group, I think, by New Musical Express, and you also got the opportunity, I think, amazingly to go on the Ed Sullivan Show. I mean, which is an amazing thing for an Australian group, I think, to have achieved back then. I mean, do you remember much about the Ed Sullivan Show performance?
Yes, I do, and it's available on YouTube as well. So, and that was all live, and it was one of those kind of one mic jobs we had to perform. It's pretty much like singing in the coffee lounge, where you just have an overhead mic. There was no separate mic. I can't remember Athol's bass being mic'd up, for instance, or it was one of those things where you just got there and did it. And he was an unusual person, shall we say, because he was quite forgetful in those days. He was making some unusual comments to us. But nevertheless, the audience was umpteen million, whatever his audience was in those days, I can't remember. And it was a fantastic experience.
Yeah, and of course, following the A World of Our Own single, we mentioned a little bit earlier, The Carnival Is Over kind of followed that. And I know that happens to be your favourite Seekers song. And like, what makes that Seekers track out of all the other tracks, out of all the albums, what makes that song your favourite?
Probably the emotion of it. It's a very simple song. I know the Russian song that Tom used, the folk song that he used as the basis for Carnival Is Over. But Judith's delivery was just fantastic, and the way the whole thing came together with the orchestra, Bobby Richards again leading the orchestra and doing the string arrangement, it just sort of came together as a song that we all loved. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if the others had a very strong love for Carnival Is Over as well.
You've got these three massive songs, and you returned to Australia, I think, in early 1966, I think it was. Am I right on that? Was that? Yeah. What was that like for you guys coming back to Australia?
Well, we came back as the support act for the Dave Clark Five. We arrived in, actually, no, it was in 1965 we came back, 1965, because it was just before the release of World of Our Own, or we'd already released World of Our Own. Yes, 1965. We came back as the support act for the Dave Clark Five. So there we were, our little acoustic group being on the stage with the rock and roll group. But by that time in Australia, of course, we'd had these two massive hits, On Front of You and World of Our Own. So the audience was pretty much on our side. And I think the Dave Clark Five people were a bit miffed by the the reception that we received from the Australian public. And we did well. They were good guys. We were good friends with them. And but we managed to struggle through that one. And we played some amazing audiences, the Festival Hall in Melbourne and that funny old revolving stage place in Sydney that was actually a boxing ring. And there was a tin shed in Adelaide. And oh dear, it was all crazy.
Yeah, I was looking over some of the footage of you guys playing live, and massive audiences, as you said. And I was kind of thinking, like, in terms of getting, like, it's the sound of your instruments and your voice. I mean, they've obviously had the mics for your voice, but getting the sound of the instruments, like, around, like, the arenas or whatever you were playing, like, how did that kind of work back then? Because, like, how did the audience get to hear what you guys were playing?
We still had to share microphones and sing as best we could, and where the guitar solos came in, we'd have to lift the guitar up to make the solo, that sort of thing. I guess that was what all the groups had to do. That was the technology at that time. It wasn't until much later that the things started to get that much more sophisticated.
I was running some numbers, and Georgy Girl, I think she sold like 3.5 million copies, and I was looking at the numbers today and what streaming and how that would work. If you wanted to sell 3.5 million copies, they'd have to be streamed like 437 million and a half times. And I'm thinking, like, how has that been for you, seeing music change so much? Like, yeah.
Well, I'm not a huge fan of streaming for the very basic reason that it pays you thrumpence.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you were saying, in those days it was much more tangible, I suppose. You had a record, you had a physical record in your hand, whether it was a 12-inch long play or a 7-inch single. To actually get numbers with Carnival's Over, for instance, there was that week leading up to us going to number one, we were selling something like over 90,000 copies a day for that whole week. It was tangible, much more understandable, I suppose. But nowadays, streaming, well, I mean, it does its job because it introduces acts to the world that may not have been seen or heard unless there was a stream. That's the way things change, I suppose. In the old days, you sang into a great big horn that led into a thing that recorded onto a cylinder, and now you're recording. I've got my home studio, pardon me, is about the size of 3 telephone booths, and that's what you can do because of the power of computers, and that leads straight away to creating digital information. That's it. We're in the digital domain now.
You mentioned your home studio there, and I'm thinking, like, in terms of the music making process, I mean, given how you've experienced it way back when it was monotape, and now you can have as many tracks as you like on the digital side of things. I mean, is it still as fun for you, and it's still as enjoyable for you to make music?
Oh yeah, it's even more enjoyable in a way because I get to do whatever I like, and I can take whatever time I need on it. For instance, last night I was up till fairly late. In fact, this morning doing some voiceovers for a documentary, and so that's the sort of thing I can do. I just sit there and do it. To think of how I might have had to do it in the past is to drive to a studio, sit in front of a microphone, and have an engineer sort of calling shots, and that sort of thing. So I love the freedom that I have with my recording.
First album came out in 2004. I mean, yeah. What inspired you to do your first kind of solo album, Secrets of the Heart?
Secrets of the Heart. Well, I'd been writing for a while, and the group had done a tour in 2003. I had all this material that I wanted to record, and Michael Cristiano, who's now a record producer, and he played guitar and accordion on lots of our tours and things like that. So, a dear man, he and I got together, and we pretty much did that album together with all the recording in his studio. And then I followed that up 3 years later with another one, and in 2010 I had my third solo CD. By the time I was doing the third one, Smile Now, I was doing much more of the recording myself, and Michael helped me with the mixing and mastering. So that was the way that whole thing evolved. But it was because I had material. I was writing.
Yeah.
I had to work out some way of getting it out there, and they've been a cornerstone of my solo concerts ever since.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, what is your favorite track then out of those 3 albums that you've kind of written? What's your and why?
Oh goodness. Well, I suppose there's the song that I had on the Seekers Future Road album, it's called Guardian Angel, Guiding Light, is probably the one that I go to more often than not, and it was also the song that I did in my little solo spot when we did the Seekers tours of 2013 and 2014, and I do that in all my solo concerts. So I suppose that one, and I recorded my version of that for the Smile Now album, and so I guess it's had a life of its own. So that's probably the short answer. But there are lots of others. I think, for instance, Smile Now, the title track of that third solo CD, was written about a family that had a young girl whose name is Georgie, as it turns out. Georgy Girl, her name was, who was profoundly deaf. And it was, the lyric kind of touches on how having a child with some sort of disability can create an extraordinary tension in a family. In this case, it led to the father leaving the family and the mother bringing up the daughter on her own. That's one of the songs that just kind of flowed out. Some songs take, I don't know, 2 or 3 months. Some songs I've been working on for 2 or 3 years, but others just come out in half an hour, 1 hour.
Yeah.
And they're almost fully finished in that time span.
Yeah, and can we expect another Keith Potger album anytime soon? Are you working on that, or is that on the works? Or
yeah, I am, as it turns out, and I've got several songs that I'm introducing gradually in my solo shows. It's very difficult to inject new stuff because there's stuff when I'm doing my solo shows. There's stuff that the audience kind of expects to hear, but I'm looking forward to doing some shows where there'll be more of my original music in each show. So that's a way of kind of road testing it, if you like. But on the other hand, I just want to do it and let it all hang out, just see what happens.
No, it sounds great, Keith. No, it sounds great. And look, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. It's been great talking with you.
Well, it's my pleasure, Jack. Thank you for your time.
That was founding member of the Seekers, Keith Potger. To check out upcoming tours, music, or any Keith Potger related content, you can head to his website at keithpotger.com. Remember to share this episode with other music fans. And if you really enjoyed this edition, let us know. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Vinyl Vibes. And to all you music lovers out there, stay groovy.